So what we're going to talk about now are how to construct graphs of sine and cosine from the unit circle. So don't forget, this is the unit circle. Sine represents the y values, and cosine represents the x. Now, in a fit of alphabetical, what we're going to do is we're going to start with y equals cosine x, where x represents the angle, right? So what we're going to talk about is going from an angle, and we're going to go all the way around the unit circle to 2 pi, okay? So there's some key points that are happening here. Cosine x. So cosine is always the x values, which means when the angle is 0, the value of cosine is a positive 1. So that'd be 1 point on our graph, okay? Then from there, it decreases, right? All the way down to 0 by the time we hit pi over 2, right? So what we've got is a graph where cosine is going to take on these different values. Now, other points of interest include, well, when we hit pi radians, I'm trying to space this out evenly, and then 3 pi over 2, right? 3 pi over 2. Some interesting things happen in those points all the way around to 2 pi, which of course is the same as 0. So what does this mean? We're progressing from 1, decreasing, to 0. Then we're continuing to decrease because notice that these are negative values of x all the way to negative 1 in the negative 1 for the value of cosine, which is the x value. And then back through 0 at 3 pi over 2 all the way up to 2 pi. Now this does end up being a smooth curve such that it increases right through here and then decreases. And if you just plot the points, you'll find that it generally follows this from the unit circle. Now, a couple of key features here. This thing is symmetric, right? Because if this keeps repeating, so this goes on and on this way, as well as this way. So in positive and negative, just think positive and negative rotations, okay? So these values here are separated by a certain amount. We're going to talk about exactly what these things are called, and when we come to solutions, it's going to end up being the case that if you look, and you know this from the unit circle, but you can see it maybe from the graph a little bit better. For any given value of y, there are 2 values of the angle that will satisfy that between 0 and 2 pi. So this is the basic shape of cosine. It starts high, decreases, goes low as negative 1, and back up to 1. For the unit circle, remember that means the radius is 1. Sine, similar, as in it's going to range between a positive 1 and a negative 1, and it's going to be on some key intervals like pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. It's going to take on some different values, except for sine is the y values. So what happens is we're looking at the y values and tracking around. So in this case, we're starting at 0, and then we're increasing. By the time we hit pi over 2, the y value is 1. Then we go back down, and the y value is back to 0. And the y value ranges to negative 1 in much the same fashion, such that in 2 pi radians, we've come, for lack of a better term, full circle. Now, just like cosine, right, this heads on ad infinitum in either direction, positive or negative rotations, if you will. So this would represent 1 rotation around there, which in an unmodified unit circle would be 2 pi radians, right? And it's going to range as a high of 1 and a low of negative 1. So you can see that there's a restriction to the range of a stock sine and cosine model, right? That's commensurate to, well, the radius of the circle, that is, represents the radius of the circle. And you see this repeating its values, right? There are 2 values for sine, that's, so 2 angles, right, that satisfy a particular y value for this, right? Okay. Now, that actually sums up what we wanted to talk about with that. Key things to remember when you're talking about sine and cosine is what the basic shape looks like. Sine x starts at 0, increases and decreases, and just keeps doing that. Whereas cosine x starts at the high end, 1, right, and then decreases. So if you can keep these two shapes sorted out, it'll save you a lot of grief moving forward. So that's all we got for constructing sine and cosine graphs.